Nearly 20% of the US market are actually using Chinese AI models. A bunch of startups that you're using that have some AI features are using Chinese AI models. So is it a good idea to go and try to ban them? Well, to find this out, I got curious. I was like, who are actually the top players? Because obviously we hear about DeepSeek, right? Like that's the one you heard the most. That's the one that about a year ago came out and everyone was like, oh my God, they did this for a few $1 million. And all of these other models are spending hundreds of billions of dollars. And this thing can just almost like perform at 80% capacity at like fraction of the cost. So people got freaked out about it, right? So they're the one that were founded essentially by this company called Highflyer, who is technically a hedge fund. Again, relatively young company, about 3 years old. Very interesting part about them, besides the cost, which we'll come back to, because there's some controversy about how you calculate the cost. But the idea that they've introduced, which you will see kind of like as a recurring theme for a lot of these Chinese-based models, is the believe in open model, or open weight model, sometimes they call it, where essentially they'll tell you exactly what the logic is behind their AI tool, so you can go and play around with it. And the other part of it is also the fact that you can go download it and install it on your local machine, on your local server, and run it versus OpenAI, Claude, Google, right? Like all of their models are SaaS models, so you have to subscribe and pay them to run their model on their servers, and you have no clue how it's working in terms of like what the weights are, what are some of the attributes that it's using. And these days it's also now multi-layered kind of like structure where they essentially agents on agents on agents, and they're all calling each other, activating certain skills to go and provide you with a result, right? Where this, you see pretty much everything that's happening outside of obviously the black box of the AI itself. So we have Highflyer, but they're not the only ones. Alibaba, who you might have heard of, who is like a biggest competitor to Amazon. They're kind of like online major retailer. They have Qwen. Qwen, again, also open. They do have their enterprise layer. So the interesting difference versus like someone like Highflyer is the fact that they do actually have enterprise plans. And funny enough, the reason why I like kind of like put the Meta here is that that's what Meta was trying to do with llamas, right? That they were out there essentially saying like, hey, we'll have this open weight, open kind of like model that everyone can use, but we're also going to have an enterprise solution that hopefully everyone's going to subscribe to. Some people are using Llama. I don't recall last time I heard of anyone subscribing to enterprise solution from Meta, where again, Qwen is pretty popular locally in China, and all of them kind of like won, I think, the Anthropic level of success right now in the enterprise world. So that was a second player. Then we also have Moonshot with their Kimi model. Kimi model was actually kind of like the second, third, I guess, depending on whatever metrics you use and depending on who you kind of like look at. The interesting part about it is that it used to trail all of them, right? I think Kimi had a misluck of releasing one of their models the day the DeepSeek released their model, which kind of like, it was a good model, but at the same time, everyone was talking about the DeepSeek everywhere and everyone was freaking out about the DeepSeek, so they completely forgot about Kimi. And Kimi now kind of like roared back into competition with the new model, which is actually outperforming, I think, in some cases some of these other models. And one of their benefits is that it's very research based. It's very kind of like heavy, complex, ingest a bunch of information, analyze it, produce me the result. This is the kind of like strength that Kimi has versus, again, some of the more standard plays that you see with the Qwen or DeepSeek. And then you have ByteDance. Yes, the guys who own the TikTok, who created TikTok Musically, whichever way you would know it, depending on the time you first interacted with that app. They essentially have their own Doubao. I couldn't trust myself to remember the name because I don't use it. I actually have not heard of it before. So I kind of like saved the name of it. This is the actual... okay, fine. You get it. This is their logo. This thingy. We're good. The cool thing about them is that it's actually has its own use case. They're very much search and e-commerce focused, right? Because again, they're part of ByteDance. ByteDance has one of the biggest, if not the biggest, social media platforms in China, and a lot of people kind of like as they interact with it, they search for something that they saw in the video, right? Like you've all heard about this like crazy short form videos and creators making millions of dollars on promoting physical products, digital goods, things of that nature. So you can actually use it, and AI powers that search, so you can go and locate those experiences, locate those products that you can take advantage of. And then finally we have Baidu. Baidu is their kind of like the biggest search engine outside of kind of like social media, right? Like that's the equivalent kind of like of Google. And they have Ernie. And the interesting part about Ernie is that it's actually a default kind of government choice. So they have very good ties. Again, that's one of the longest standing technology companies in China. They have good connections with the Communist Party. And so a lot of things that the government does from the AI perspective is actually based on Ernie. And they're also very good at native Chinese processing, right? So they actually, where other models, from everything that I've seen, they do operate in English, and I think Ernie operates in English pretty fine. From perspective of the amount of information that's stored across all these models and the accuracy of it, Ernie kind of like leads it from the perspective of native Chinese. So it's a very interesting space, right? Like, again, like we have 3/4. You can call Llama from Meta or Grok as part of it to make it 5, right? Between Gemini, Claude, OpenAI, and kind of like Grok and Llama is a distant second or whatever they call it on Meta these days. So they can kind of like have this interesting structure and how these companies all compete with each other because they're all in open competition with each other. That's an interesting fact. And so my next question was like, okay, but what's the government's approach? Like, I was curious, how do they approach it? And what we're about to talk about from the US government perspective, like, how does it differ from our approach? And the interesting part is that first and foremost, of course, Chinese government does prohibit external models, right? Like that's a big thing. So you'll hardly probably find their enterprises using Claude or using OpenAI because they're really kind of like recommend it to go and use local Chinese models. And that's where kind of like the local adoption is important. And the other part, the reason why I'm comparing it to electric cars, the number of those kind of like tools, and also that's just top 5 from what I've seen. There's like local governments sometimes within certain states and provinces, they promote it. There's some other companies that are trying to build their own models. There's this promotion of heavy competition, and that's what happened with the electric cars in China, where instead of trying to say like, hey, you are our favorite, BYD or whoever else, they were like, yeah, you guys go at it, whoever wins. And that kind of like created this essentially the atmosphere, right, of competition. They were all pushing for better features, and ultimately through that competition they did not only sharpen themselves to the point where you can kind of like have now a stacked whatever stack, I guess, hierarchy in China. They also outcompeted Teslas and other cars of the world, right? Like they're just better cars thanks to that heavy competition. And so with the models, I think that's what we're going to continue to see, is that fostering and like almost like promoting them to compete with each other creates the environment in which people trying to push harder and harder and harder, versus we're going to talk about what some of the local industry leaders are trying to propose. And then from the perspective of kind of like how we start seeing them is because of this kind of like competition, similar to the cars, right? It sharpens them, and then whoever is the winner, let's go show us what you're going to do with the rest of the world. Hence DeepSeek immersion, right, about a year ago. And so that's interesting approach. It's a policy. We're not going to talk about Chinese government policy outside of this today. It's a completely different topic. But then that kind of like raises this question: how does it differ from how we're approaching it, right, between US and China? And that's one of the things I wanted to call out, is that the factoid is actually technically closer to 18%, but 18% of the businesses right now are using, right, some of these models, versus about 35% of the market uses US models. US models are bigger, right? Like Claude is pretty successful with the enterprises, like OpenAI is somewhere out there. Gemini is pretty good, right? And it's also part of the standard kind of like business subscription for Google. But you have this kind of like competition arising, and a lot of companies are essentially moving to use Chinese models primarily because of the cost, right? The other part of it is also the fact that US models are all API and kind of like token usage driven, right? Again, what I mentioned earlier, you have to subscribe and you have to keep paying. Essentially, again, OpenAI, you have to keep paying Anthropic, Google for the use of those models, right? And they can adjust the cost per token. They can adjust the number of tokens for certain things that you're trying to run. So it can become very expensive, right? We all heard about some of these customers and clients of some of these companies that spend like millions and billions of dollars on the token usage, versus a lot of these, so I think majority of these Chinese models, with except of like what we mentioned with Quen, where they have the API-based enterprise plan, they're all downloaded on your machine and run it. And you're essentially just paying for the compute, right? If you're spinning up the virtual machine, you're essentially paying for that. You're paying for usage of however expensive the machine that you spun up in the cloud, and you just place the model there and operate within that environment. Which, funny enough, which I found very ironic, coming from China, it actually complies better with laws like GDPR, which require you to store the data locally, right? From whatever the usage might be for the software. That's one of those big components of policies like GDPR and some of the other local kind of like European policies that sometimes limit SaaS companies in terms of how they can operate in those regions. Some of the other Asian countries are also introducing it. These kind of models comply with it because you can spin up the environment in that particular geography and essentially have the model running in that geography, and then similar model with similar weights that you're using for your company, you can spin it up on the other US based server and essentially run it independently, complying with all the laws. Where with someone like, again, Claude, you cannot do that because who knows where they store the data, right? And they'll probably produce some documents to tell you that they're storing the data in the region and they're working on this. But that's this interesting kind of like dynamic counterbalance between these, interesting models and companies that are participating in the market, which leads me now naturally to this series of questions that I'm sure you've had. You were looking at the screen and you're saying, hey, but like, what's one of the major benefits, right? One of them. I know you have more questions, and I promise you we'll get to them. This was kind of like the comparison that I got from Gemini, right? So again, I don't know if it can cook and lower the numbers for itself, but these were rough kind of like cost per 1 million of tokens, right, between all these models. And it's just a crazy comparison, right? Like if you look at, again, something like, and Claude was right out of the gates. They were like, hey, it's a very expensive model. Like you're going to burn through a ton of, tokens pretty quickly, which seems like it does based on the usage that I've seen. That's because for work, I do use Claude a lot. Right, I'm not a user of OpenAI products, so I'm not very familiar. But again, the contrast and the comparisons, and Moonshot makes sense from the perspective of the research, right? Kind of like the complexity of the runs that they do, kind of makes sense. Grok, who cares? And then from the perspective of some of these other models, right? This is ridiculous. And I didn't include Z.AI, but they're one of those like top 5, top 6, depending on which list you look. People argue if they should make top 5 as a company. So the costs are substantially different, right, from the perspective of the profile that you're operating in. And then you start talking about some of these other points that I'm sure, again, you were wondering, you're asking, and the biggest one is distillation. Distillation is essentially the process where the company is like, again, high flyer, runs a bunch of very specific queries within someone like Claude, something like Gemini or ChatGPT, and use it as a way to infer how that model was trained and kind of like extract that training information and put it in your model to expedite its learning process, right? So that's where when initial kind of like headline number was like, oh my God, they spent less than $6 million to train DeepSeek, and OpenAI here spent $100 billion, right? Like the reality of it is, yeah, but they spent $5 million on a tech to go and pretty much train on top of something like Claude, something like ChatGPT, and leverage their learnings in a distilled format to train their model. That's why it's basically called kind of like distillation process. And yeah, I agree that to some extent one can say it's an issue. The other one, karma. And the karma, and the reason being, how did they get all this data? Where did they get all this data? So I don't know. If you stole an apple and someone else stole an apple from you, is it still a crime? Probably, but where did the apple come from to begin with? So I kind of like, I'll leave it at that. The other part about it is also like, okay, but we have this whole memory shortage. We have these GPUs. They're all going crazy. It's impossible to build a PC under $2,000 today to do anything. How are these producers and manufacturers reacting, right? And NVIDIA, I think, is my favorite example here because it's a massive company here in the United States. It's a US-based company, right? And they have this kind of like a dance that they're trying to do because Jensen Huang been trying to like cozy up to Trump and essentially Trump's administration, current president's administration, and work with them and the local customers and like, hey, we're going to support you, provide you with the best equipment. But at the same time, I'm out there like talking and praising how amazing these Chinese models are, and talking about kind of like how I want to be friends over here because primarily he wants to continue to sell. NVIDIA wants to continue to sell into the Chinese market. So for them, it's imperative to not seem too biased, right, between those two. And the part of it is also because if US goes and bans, for example, right, some of these GPUs, and hey, we're not going to use the models, and we're going to talk about the models ban specifically. But even if the US, say, continues to try and ban NVIDIA from selling GPUs into the Chinese market, or Chinese company or Chinese government goes and stops local organizations from buying NVIDIA chips, which actually happened, you essentially creating this environment where you're going to start seeing kind of like bursts of growth for the local hardware manufacturers. Like Huawei is one of those who are like trying really hard right now, pushing to build a comparable set of GPUs for the AI training. And NVIDIA is scared of that. NVIDIA is scared of that because same way as it happened with some of these models where they just show up on the American market or the global market with a much cheaper product, same thing might happen there. Huawei, if they build close enough of a product, if say they build product that is like 80-70% maybe of power of these GPUs, but it costs like 20% of the total cost, everyone's going to stop buying them, right? And NVIDIA going to see the pressure on their pricing, and they'll have to lower the prices for all of their GPUs, right? So they're afraid of that. They don't want it. They understand it. So they're trying to work with China. But I think China have seen enough at this point, and knowing that US government can go and ban the sale of GPUs, they're going to definitely continue to promote, and kind of like the ship has sailed, I think, on that point. We showed our cards from the US perspective. Chinese saw it and they were like, okay, I got you. I know, I see how it is now. And I think they're going to continue promoting and building their own local GPUs. And they're going to train all of these models on those local GPUs. And then the next question is like, how is the Silicon Valley reacting to all of this, right? And I can zoom in probably a little bit more. How are they reacting? What is happening, right? And here you see this interesting dynamic where OpenAI and like Anthropic seemingly finally, agree on something. They agree on the fact that basically what I refer to it is they want to pull the ladder, right? Like they want to say, hey, like let's not let them in. We're kind of like at the top. People know us. People use us. Let's stop everyone else from developing, basically. And yes, we should ban everyone. Government should really be supervising the review of every single model. And every model comes up, government should supervise, because ultimately what they're trying to create, and that's what Anthropic plan all in all, right? Like the whole conversation about the Mythos and Fable 5 and like, oh my god, this is so scary. That's such a scary application. We need to teach people how to use it, otherwise the entire world will collapse. Or OpenAI, honestly, like recent whole thing about some agent going rogue and like going finding vulnerability and doing some other stuff. Again, I think it's just a PR run trying to scare them, the government, enough to say like, you should regulate us. Like, hold me, bro, like regulate us. It's not because they're so in favor of the regulation of themselves. They are in favor of being the ones to co-write the regulations for everyone else. That's their plan. And in return, you have the Little Tech Association in Silicon Valley really defending these international models, because guess what? All these startups that are rising, that sort of at their seed stage, they cannot afford paying billions of dollars and millions of dollars for the tokens to OpenAI Anthropic. They like the fact that they can go pick up one of those open weight models, put them on their servers, and run them at a few $1,000s a month, right? Like that's their kind of like what do we call it? I was going to say favoritism, but no, that's their advantage right now, right? Like that's how they can be scrapey about building their own business. And obviously these two guys, they don't want that. And that kind of like also, I think, leads to this whole conversation about like, hey, US government might just start saying, no, we are going to block you. Or there was a conversation that I think Bassin, or one of the folks in the administration, said, we want to ask these startups and all these companies to start disclosing if their tools and their services are based on these Chinese models, which they can do technically, kind of like Chinese government does it right now in their region, but they can do a lot more in control of the pricing and the adoption. Because if we're going to do it right now in the US, for example, and they're going to go and ban all these models, and they're going to say, hey, that's it, it's only American-based models, that's all you can use, and then we're going to put additional tariffs on taxes or something on you if you're using one of those international models. And guess what's going to happen? These local models, they'll be like, cool, now we can name the price, because what? Who they're going to buy it from? Right? And you're going to see always, that's what always happens with if you don't have like Chinese government, they have full control over both ends, right? They have control over the policies, but they can also go to those companies and force them to set certain prices. Here, you technically cannot do this. This is illegal. And also, most likely half of your staff at that point are on their payroll through lobbying. So guess what? You're not going to do anything. And OpenAI and Anthropic will just set the price, and the market will have to pay it because they will have no access, and it will affect local companies. And the other part is that because of what they'll try to achieve with this kind of like high pricing locally, a lot of international competition will not be affected, because a lot of these other international startups, they're going to continue to use some of these international open weight models. And so they're going to build cheaper products and services that you risk now the situation where a lot of these local-based American companies simply cannot compete on prices of their services for AI products versus some startup in Europe or some startup in Asia. And it's the reality of the situation you can create. And it's not the only one, because then there's this also interesting impact on the talent, right? Because with better H-1B programs, kind of like more friendly towards international, high value, very talented, especially STEM individuals, you now pushing on that button at the same time again, essentially sending them off back to their countries. And guess what? If there are a bunch of PhDs from China, and funny enough, like Moonshot and Kimi was built by a former, I think, Carnegie Mellon or something like this, PhDs. They got education here, they worked at Meta here, they worked at local tech companies here. Yes, they had an opportunity to stay, but they chose like, hey, we gained enough, we can now move back and do our own thing. And now they're building one of the most competitive, one of the best models out there in the world, right? Like allegedly. I'm, at the end of the day, not an expert on all the performance benchmarks. But that's also kind of like, in parallel, if you're pushing the button on the market and you're forcing local companies to pay for much more expensive products and you're limiting their ability to compete internationally, you're also sending all the talent outside of the United States, right? So there's like this inadvertent effect from the policies that will have negative repercussions for a lot of tech startups locally. And then finally, in all of this, you kind of like look and say, hey, what is the EU's doing? And they have menstrual right in France and all that stuff. But one of those things I actually wanted to note, although it's not directly AI related, but one of the recent news was the fact that France is like really pushing hard towards moving off of Windows to Linux machines, stop using essentially US-based SaaS companies, services, and products. And it matters because that's the problem with the tariffs. That's the problem with the bad policies in terms of like the talent, the bad policies in terms of like international relationships. They're important because in a place where if we did not have the tariffs, if we maintain good relationships with all of these European countries, right? Like you could say, like, no, guys, like we know they're international models, but we're going to work some deal out where if you're going to use Claude, you're going to use ChatGPT, you're going to get some favorable pricing. We might even subsidize it. You all can use it. You're going to continue using our services and build that platform, right? Like continue to build the platform among your allies who continue to use the services of your companies from here. And that might naturally crowd out the market against folks using Chinese-based models. Because yes, the real argument, and I didn't even mention it over there, but it's real. Like, is there a backdoor for the Chinese Communist Party through all of these models to any data that's being plopped into it? Is there some like sleeper code out there that, although yes, you installed it on a local machine, somehow it wakes up and sends you information the moment it has access to the internet, right? Like, those are real concerns. And I've been in cybersecurity enough to know that those holes are very possible through a lot of different ways and third-party software, and there might be some roundabout ways to get to it, even if it's not directly the model itself that sends it, right? You're the author of the model, you probably know its vulnerability as well. So it's a real concern. And so people don't want to use it. But you're kind of forcing them right now, because if I'm international, kind of like if I'm a startup somewhere in Europe trying to develop my tech, and I'm kind of like looking, yes, I want to use Claude, I want to use these guys, but like if they're going to start getting more expensive thanks to the policies, or I'm just like under the economic pressure, I cannot afford paying X amount of dollars just period to some of these companies, I am starting to look at all of these open weight models and say like, hey, we can afford, from the savings that we're not going to spend on OpenAIs and Claudes of the world, we can afford using some of these much cheaper models, maybe not as strong of a models, but we trust that that delta that we're going to save, maybe that's something we allocate towards cybersecurity and towards our own engineers who are going to build up on the basis of that model that we're going to get from one of these Chinese companies and build a better product. Like, that's a real logic. Like, how it's going to work in practice, I don't know. I bet there's several startups who are trying it right now, and I'm very curious to see how that's going to work. But that's the reality of things, where if you start making these kind of policy decisions, and that's why I'm not a fan of bans and not a fan of like trying to protect local companies. There are important situations where you have to, from the security perspective, of course, but you basically create an environment where companies can get complacent. Companies can get lazy and not develop as much and just try to squeeze every single dollar because they think in the quarters, basically due to their potential public status, right? So you cannot necessarily create that kind of environment. So you have to compete. But I also understand the fact that like there's a security exposure. There's some other concerns that might arise from prevalence of these models locally. So it's just an interesting dynamic. Do I have a perfect answer? I do not. I was just curious because there is this whole conversation about, do we ban them? Do we not ban them? And I just got curious. I'm like, let me just actually read up and see what kind of companies are out there, what is the effect, and just think a little bit more about what can be the repercussions of a ban versus not a ban, versus what's going to happen to the local market in Silicon Valley and these big multi-billion and trillion-dollar startups versus local companies and smaller companies of 2 to 5 people who are trying to make their name in this game. It's a mess. It's just a mess because with all these regulations, with all this like, yes tariffs, no tariffs, yes tariffs, no tariffs, you're a friend, you're enemy, you're an enemy now you're a friend. Like, this is why stable policies at the government at federal level are so important, because there's already enough going on in the business itself to figure out. And if on top of that you have to navigate this like seesaw of different things happening at the federal and honestly even sometimes local state level, it gets hard. It gets hard to get the decision right, where you especially competing versus someone who forget, right, kind of like for a second, your criticism, or maybe some of you are fans of Communist Party, I don't know, but that side, they're all rowing in the same direction because they don't have an option. They might be chained to those, whatever, they're rowing seats, but they're still rowing in the same direction. So that's this interesting situation in the panic room of a bunch of people running in different directions, trying to create one cozy space for themselves. Here you have the entire machine kind of like all moving in the same direction. I do feel like that's how you get outcompeted, and that's how you get left behind at the international space, right? But that's where you need friends, and if you're not making friends, that makes it even worse. So again, I'll stop there. This video wasn't about politics and policies, but you see how influential those are in the businesses like this. So I hope you learned something. I learned a ton through the process of creating this video, and I wanted to share some of this knowledge with you. I'll see you next Saturday. Peace.